todos. Bienvenidos a esta conferencia del día de hoy que nos impartirá el doctor Tom Vogel de la Universidad de California en San Diego. Este evento es organizado por el Departamento de Estudios Económicos en conjunto con la Maestría en Economía Aplicada. Bueno, antes de empezar, les voy a leer una breve semblanza del doctor Vogel. Él es licenciado en Economía por la Universidad de Princeton y maestro y doctor en Economía por la Universidad de Harvard. Actualmente es profesor asociado en el Departamento de Economía en la Universidad de California en San Diego. Su investigación se centra en temas relacionados al desarrollo, la demografía, la salud y el capital humano. Es coeditor del Journal of Development Economics y ha sido editor asociado del Journal of Human Resources y Demography. Y bueno, tiene textos de muy alto nivel, los cuales los ha publicado en revistas como el American Economic Review, el Review of Economics and Statistics y el Economic Journal, entre muchas otras. Y también recientemente obtuvo el segundo lugar en el premio en Economía Víctor Urquidi del Colegio de México, un trabajo que hizo con Fernanda Márquez y con Susan Parker. Bienvenido, Tom. Gusto en recibirte.
Muchas gracias. Gracias por la invitación y gracias a todos ustedes por estar aquí. Yo puedo hablar español, pero no muy bien, y estoy seguro que ustedes pueden entender inglés mejor que yo en español, así que voy a hablar en inglés si está bien. ¿Sí? Okay. Pero ustedes pueden preguntar en español también. Gracias.
Listo. La presentación, si la pueden poner, por favor.
Okay, so this is joint work with Fernanda Márquez Padilla, who's in el Colegio de México, and Susan Parker, who was at CIDE for many years, but is now at the University of Maryland. And so, you know, when we started this project, it was motivated by wanting to learn about the consequences of ending this very large, very important social program in Mexico that was important more broadly in the history of development programs around the world. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But as we were working on it, we sort of realized that this episode that I'm going to talk about, when Postura ended in 2019, was part of a broader global trend, which this sociologist at Brown University named Joseph Heller calls retrenchment populism. So there have been a lot of populist leaders in many large countries around the world. Oh, I lost my TV. In many large countries around the world. Here we go. Who have sort of campaigned and governed with this politics of pulling back large social programs and pulling back universal rights for citizens. And so I've just listed a few here. So Heller writes primarily about Bolsonaro in Brazil, who pulled back on a large social security pension program, and Modi in India, who has also worked to undo universal rights. In the U.S., we also have a populist government that is pulling back on a lot of social programs actively in the moment. And here in Mexico, you know, different from many of these other examples where they're sort of right-wing populists, here in Mexico, there's sort of a more left-wing populist government that also pulled back on some very long-standing social programs. Today, I'm going to talk about Prospera, but of course, there was also Seguro Popular and other examples as well. And so we think this is sort of a broad phenomenon that's associated with the rise of populism in the past decade or so. And a big part of this phenomenon that Heller calls retrenchment populism is the sudden, abrupt, sometimes surprising rollback of very large, sometimes very long-standing programs, okay, like in the case of Prospera. And what's sort of interesting about these sudden rollbacks, including what's going on in the US right now, is that oftentimes
we may have good evidence on the effectiveness of the program from the time of rollout, right? So in Progressa's case, there was a randomized control trial, right? There are also studies of differences studies of rollout. But oftentimes, if a program is successful and exists for a long time, there may not be very recent evidence or evidence based on recent variation on its effectiveness. And that sort of allows false narratives to be developed, right? Or narratives that are not based in facts. So, a politician could say the program is corrupt, so it's not effective anymore. I think that's actually similar to some of the discourse that was happening around the time of Prospera's end. Or a politician might say the program achieved its goals, it's from 20 years ago, it's no longer necessary, right? And if we don't have recent variation that allows us to evaluate the program, it makes it hard to base those policy discussions in fact. And so we think that makes it especially important when these large-scale rollbacks, these large-scale program endings occur, that we should check and see what exactly happened, what were the consequences of pulling back the program. And so we're going to study the end of Prospera, which I'm sure, as everybody here knows, started as Progressa in the late 90s. That rollback was in 2019, and at the time, the program was serving about a quarter of Mexican households, some 7 million households. So it was a big program serving a lot of people. And it was a very influential program because it was one of the very first conditional cash transfer programs. These are programs that condition anti-poverty payments on investment in kids. It was also one of the very first randomized evaluations of a development program. And so it sort of helped pave the way to, this experimental approach to development economics that won a Nobel Prize about 5 years ago. And so we think this is a really important episode to study to understand its effects. I think maybe I have to work a little bit harder to convince audiences outside Mexico that this is an important event, but we do think that there are sort of broader lessons here for what's going on around the world. I also think, by the way, the Trump administration is working on pulling back social programs within the U.S., but it has also slashed international aid, which is likely to lead to similar rollbacks around the world, even without the sort of political movement that I just described. Okay, so if one wants to think about the consequences of rollback, the big policy discussion is going to hinge on whether pulling back a program is going to have the opposite effect of rolling out the program, 20 years earlier. And we think that it's not obvious that those two will be symmetric. In the case of Prospera, there have been a lot of changes, to Mexican society, to Mexican education, to the Mexican economy in the 20 plus years since Progressa was rolled out. So back when Progressa was rolled out, for example, the big goal was to get more kids into, we'll call it middle school in English, but to get more kids to stay past primaria and stay for secundaria. And so in the decade after Progressa started, secundaria reached a quite high level and stabilized, basically, something at like 90% enrollment. And the big increases in schooling since then have been at the prepa level rather than secundaria. And also back then, there was a push to make payments especially attractive for girls rather than boys, because there was a desire to get more girls enrolled in school. But since then, girls have overtaken boys, and so there have been a lot of changes in the landscape. And one could look at that and say, well, this program was designed a long time ago. It's probably not working anymore as we thought it was back then, and so maybe we can take it away and do something else with the money. And then, I put up here a bunch of other hypotheses that are less grounded in evidence, but, norms about education, especially girls' education, could have changed. There could have been changes in the liquidity of the households and their ability to finance education over the following 20 years. There could have been changes in what households see as the status quo, what you're supposed to do with kids, right? And so all of these things may change, either make bigger or make smaller the effects of rollback relative to the effects of rollout. And so we think these, I'm going to say this quickly, but we think these issues relate to three questions in the impact evaluation literature. One is whether programs adapt to policy conditions as they changed after an initial evaluation. So there's a big literature on an early childhood education program called Head Start in the US that has a lot of variation over time in how effective this program is. And it depends, for example, on what the private childcare market looks like, and that has evolved a lot, and that means that the original estimates are different from the estimates you get from evaluations nowadays. There are also two literatures in development economics, one about whether program impacts last. So if you have a short cash transfer program, and then you end the cash transfer program, do the benefits of being in a treatment group last after the cash ends? And the answer seems to mostly be no. Mostly the benefits disappear, although there are some nuances. And then also there's a literature on the long-term effects of conditional cash transfer programs. That literature is mostly focused on sort of following the initial cohorts exposed to the rollout when they grow up, right? But another way to think about the long-term effects of these cash transfer programs is to think about like what happens to current kids after the cash transfer program disappears. So what are we going to do? We're going to ask, how did the rollback of Prospera affect school and labor market outcomes in kids and youth? So, school-age kids up to the end of high school. And we're going to do the differences in design, comparing before the rollback to after the rollback in parts of Mexico and localities that had very high program penetration versus very low program penetration. And we're going to find that after the rollback in high Prospera penetration areas, there were large reductions in school enrollment and large increases in labor force participation, mainly in high school boys. So we'll find some effects, especially for schooling in some other demographic groups too, but this is really focused in high school boys. So basically, the conclusion is that this program was keeping a bunch of boys in school and away from work. And we'll have to spend a little time thinking about whether that's when I told that to like the average development economist, they said, "Oh, that sounds very bad." But when I told it to the average economist from a different field, they said, "Well, it's not really obvious whether that's a bad thing or a good thing. Maybe those boys were being kept in school when they weren't gaining much from school, and maybe their labor market prospects didn't benefit that much from school, given where they were living in Mexico or something like that." And so we're going to argue that it does seem that this will turn out to be quite costly for these boys. In particular, most of them we're going to look carefully at what sorts of jobs they were doing when they dropped out, and we'll find that they're working in industries like construction, where right now wages look very good. So wages like in their teens and 20s look very good. And actually they can do as well without finishing high school, working in construction as they can in any other field with or without high school. But later on in their 30s and 40s, they would start to experience a big wage gap relative to their peers who finished high school. So we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about robustness, both thinking about playing with the regression specification and also thinking about the fact that the Mexican government took the money from Prospera and reappropriated it to this new program, well, now 5-year-old program, Becas Benito Juárez. And we'll think about what exactly that looked like, where that money went, and whether we can disentangle the effect of Becas Benito Juárez from the effect of Prospera. Okay, let's get into any questions. So I don't think I have to spend a lot of time talking to this audience about what Prospera was. It was a conditional cash transfer program that basically, and you could say, paid poor families to invest in their kids, or you could say that conditioned their anti-poverty payments on having their kids in school and taking their younger kids to health checkups. This was a long-standing program that especially targeted rural areas. And it was means tested. It was specifically for the poor. There is a huge, voluminous literature on the effects of this program, in large part because of the pioneer and randomized control trial. My co-author, Susan, is a co-author on maybe about a third of those 6,000 papers or something like that. So I'm just listing a few of the papers here. In the short run, this is evidence principally from the randomized control trial. The program increased school enrollment in middle school, especially for kids as they transitioned from primary to secundaria, right? So if you manage to get the program started before a kid dropped out after finishing primary, you could keep them in school for many years after that. And when we look at the originally exposed cohorts in the long run, when they grow up, we see higher rates of completion of both secundaria and prepa among those who got taught by the program before they dropped out after primary. Okay, so this was a very successful program, and it lasted through many presidential administrations, through many governments here in Mexico, right? It changed names a few times as each president wanted to sort of
claim some credit for it, but it's the sign of a very successful program, and it's able to be stable across different governments. However, in 2019 it ended, and I just wanted to walk you through sort of what the timeline looked like. So, in the middle of 2018, López Obrador was elected president of Mexico, and there were some rumors that he might end the program. But initially, he pushed back against those rumors. So I have the first headline here is from October of 2018, just before he took office, and he announced that he was not going to cancel Prospera. But then in early 2019, there were lots of reports of families losing their benefits, of not being able to get their benefits. And then finally, in the middle of 2019, a year after he was elected, they announced that Prospera was going to be eliminated. And that they were going to take the money and reappropriate it to the Becas Benito Juárez program. And so, a lot of our time, there were like two things we spent a lot of time thinking about, separate from the analyses of the outcome data. One, we spent a lot of time trying to get data from Transparencia about what actually happened, which was very difficult. We had to submit many requests to try to get the data on what happened to spending in different localities.
And the other was trying to think about what exactly Becas Benito Juárez was, who got it, and whether we should think of it as this as being sort of a temporary pause in benefits, that then benefits were resumed under the new program, or whether this was really a radical reduction in benefits to the poor living in these rural communities that used to benefit a lot from Prospera. And we think it's going to be, we're going to argue that it's the latter, that for poor families and communities that were benefiting a lot from Prospera, there was an enormous reduction in the amount of resources that they were getting. So there are some, nuanced differences between Prospera and Becas Benito Juárez. Okay, the one big change was that it moved from having sort of a single family grant with adjustments for the demographic composition of the household, for how old the kids are, what sex they were, and so on. Now there's going to be, for everything below preparatoria, there was a fixed grant per month, so 800 pesos per month, regardless of how many kids you have in school. If you have at least one kid in school, you get that grant. So that's a big reduction from the grants under Prospera. And then for the kids who are in high school, they can get direct payments of the same amount, a payment per child.
Youth, I guess you could say. And they can actually sign up themselves to get it at school, right? So it's sort of splitting off the high school component of the program and paying the students directly. It looks, from the patterns that I'll show you in a second, it looks like kids in poor rural places did not have better access to the program than kids who were living in very wealthy places. And part of that is just because this individual grant program for the high school level was not means tested. It was universal for everybody, regardless of their household income. And so what I'm going to argue is that this combination of factors meant that families in poor rural areas lost a lot, and you can see that here. So here I have along the x-axis the índice de marginación, or actually it turned into percentiles, so the first percentile of marginación up to the 99th percentile of marginación at the locality level. And the black circles are just within each percentile of the marginalization index, what share of households are receiving Prospera benefits, and this is just before rollback or just before AMLO's election in 2017. And so you can see it basically goes from 0 in the least marginalized parts of Mexico up to around 100% in the most marginalized localities. It goes a little bit above 1 because we're dividing the 2017 beneficiary count by the 2010 population from the 2010 census, and so the denominator is a little wrong, and that's why you get these rates a little above 100%. And then, it would be nice to be able to compute that same share, same beneficiary share for Becas Pinto Juarez, but it's a little complicated because there are now 2 lists. Rather than just having a list of households, you have a list of households and you have a list of, high school age children who are receiving benefits, and the linkage between those children and their households is not that clear. So for comparing benefits between the 2 programs, we found it most useful to just add up all of the benefits, right, accruing to households and individuals in those localities, and just to compare what benefits per household were in 2017 under Prospera and what they were in 2019 under Becas Pinto Juarez. And here you can see very clearly, this works, under Prospera you go from 0 pesos per household in better off localities up to about over 10,000 pesos per household for the year in the poorest localities. But for Becas Pinto Juarez, it basically flattens out, right? And you can see here that there's this huge drop in benefits per household in the poorest parts of Mexico, and actually down here, in the big cities where the margination index is low, you actually get an increase in benefits, right? So this was like a highly regressive change, right? These are consistent with a balanced budget, with using the same amount of resources, because this down here is where most Mexicans live. You can see down here we have the distribution of households, and so you're shifting resources from places where not a lot of people live to much wealthier places where most people live. I will say, by the way, that the positive slope here is just from the Educación Básica component, which is payments to households, which still is means tested, but the graph for the Media Superior program is completely flat. All right. All right. So what are we going to have? Maybe 20 minutes left? Yeah. Okay. We're going to link this up with sort of a standard public use household survey, the NOA. So we're going to use data from 2014 up until just before the COVID-19 pandemic, just like the first quarter of 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic, in addition to being a tragedy, is very inconvenient to us because, after that first quarter of 2020, it becomes very unclear what it even means to ask somebody if their child is enrolled in school. On top of that, the survey stopped for a short time, then became a phone survey, which is not really comparable to the original survey. And then actually when it returned to normal operations, the public use files stopped including locality codes. And so we are basically going to study this first year of rollback, and then we'll get cut off by all of the disruption of COVID. And so we will link these outcome data from the NOA to locality level administrative data from Prospera and Becas Pinto Juarez, right? And so, as I said, we sent in many requests to Transparencia and eventually got enough data to put together a measure of the share of households receiving Prospera benefits in 2017, and then also measures of benefits per capita or benefits per household under both programs at the locality level. Okay, and so our main covariate then is going to be the beneficiary share. So sorry about that. So the number of families receiving Prospera benefits just before it ended, divided by the total number of households in the locality in the most recent census. So we see that as being sort of a more intuitive way of capturing the effects rather than in per peso terms. We could say how an increase of or a decrease of X number of pesos per household, how much effect does that have? Instead, we're going to say, a decrease of X percent of households has an effect or something. All right, so I should move quickly through this. Here, I just want to show some basic patterns from the survey. Okay, the thing I want to highlight here is that we would expect to see the most action in terms of both school enrollment and work in these ages here. So we wouldn't expect to see much effect on school enrollment at the primary level because it's almost 100%, right? Maybe a little bit at the secondary level, but really this is where you have the most change, the most change and the most possibility of having effects on school enrollment. And similarly for work, when we look at labor force participation, we're going to look actually exclusively at kids in this age group here, 15 to 17, and we're going to expect to find bigger effects on boys than on girls because work is much more prevalent among boys than girls. Okay, the one other descriptive pattern I wanted to show you was that most dropout happens over the summer. Okay, so this is just showing you, so the NOA has this 5-wave rotating panel. So it allows you to follow the same kids for just a little over a year. Okay? And that allows us to check if a student was enrolled in the fall, are they still enrolled in the winter? If they were enrolled in the winter, are they still enrolled in the spring? If they're enrolled in the spring, are they still enrolled the following fall? Okay? And there is, some dropout in between all seasons, but that rate of dropout, that rate of leaving school, is much higher over the summer than in between any other terms. Do you have a question?
Sí,
está bien.
Entonces, ¿no tuviste problema cuando dice el seguimiento al panel rotatorio, no tuviste problema para no sé, de attrition ahí, en esta parte?
Sí, there is attrition. The attrition, we checked closely. I mean, we checked much more closely for our main analyses rather than for this graph. But the attrition is mostly at the household level. So it's mostly that households are dropping out, not that the kids themselves are dropping out, while their parents stay in. And so, yeah, we could have a conversation about whether that plays a role here. It does not play a role in our main results, but I should check this more. But we think it's also intuitive that most people finish a year of school and then decide I'm going to go do something else. Right? And this is going to be important for us because the rollback was a long process, right? Basically, when AMLO was elected, people started thinking maybe this is going to happen, right? Then he said it's not going to happen. Then he said maybe it will happen. Then people started losing their benefits, right? And then the program officially ended over the summer of 2019, right? And then when the following August, when the next school year started, that's when we really expect to see the effects show up. So this is going to be informative for thinking about the timing when we should see the effects here in the data. All right, so what we're going to do is run sort of a slight variation of a standard difference in differences regression. So what we have here is an outcome Y, so it's going to be school enrollment or work for individual I from locality L in state S and year T. And so we have this Prospera measure, which is the share of households receiving Prospera just before the end of the program. Okay? And we're going to interact that with dummies for the 2018 to 19 school year and the 2019 to 20 school year. Okay? And we expect the effects to really show up for this beta for the 2019 to 20 school year, because that's the school year in which before the start of the school year, people would have definitely lost their benefits and made those summer dropout decisions. Okay? But the 18-19 school year is sort of in this in-between period when you might have already started to see some effects. A standard thing to do would be to include those interactions and differences design, and then to include locality fixed effects and year fixed effects. Okay? We're going to modify that in two slight ways. One is that we're not going to include locality fixed effects because the same localities don't appear many times in the NOA. And so we're going to absorb that cross-sectional variation by just including a continuous variable in the postura. And then we're also going to make our year fixed effects more flexible. So we're going to interact the year dummies with state dummies so that we do like these differences within states rather than across all of Mexico. So we'll only, basically that implies that our parallel trends assumption only has to hold within states and not across all of Mexico. We'll play with that. We'll show you that the results also hold if we just include year fixed effects. And we'll show you that the results also hold if we include municipality interactions, so that we only compare changes in school enrollment over time across localities in the same municipality as they lose Prospera benefits. Any questions about this? Okay, so the next slide is just a simple modification of the same thing. So we still have, you know, the cross-sectional heterogeneity picked up by Prospera and the time heterogeneity picked up by this state year fixed effect. And then now the only thing is that we're including interactions for every single quarter rather than just for the 2018 school year and the 2019 school year, right? So this will allow us to show an event study where you'll be able to look to see if it looks like trends are parallel before the policy change, and then to see when effects show up. Okay, so this is what the event studies look like. This is for school enrollment. Okay. You can see here that, as expected, we see the most action, the most change here for the kids who are of high school age, who are at this age when enrollment rates are lower. Okay. There's a little bit of a drop-off here for the 12 to 14-year-old. If you squint, you can see an even smaller one for the primary school age kids. But basically, one thing you should say, right, is that in all of these cases, the trends look pretty parallel in the lead-up to the policy change. So this is when AMLO was elected, and this is when we expect all the summer dropout decisions to happen. Okay, this is the fall of 2019. And you can see here that there's this big drop-off of close to 10 percentage points in school enrollment in the localities that had the highest penetration of the program. So those departures from previous trends look especially strong for boys. Actually, both boys of high school age and boys of secondary school age. For girls, it's a little muddier. There does seem to be a drop-off here, but also, many of the point estimates are below zero before the change too. So we'll see when we get to the point estimates that the estimated effects for girls are closer to zero and are not statistically significant. And so that's what we get here. So this is just estimating, basically the same regression but with fewer interactions, so we can summarize the effects. And you can see here that in the 2019-20 school year, basically, the relationship between Prospera penetration and school enrollment became much more steeply negative. So that if you want to think about these as like the effect of fully rolling back Prospera compared to not, I just lost my screen up here. You would say that that rolling back Prospera, removing Prospera in places that were fully saturated, where all households were getting benefits, reduced school enrollment among teenagers by 9 percentage points, okay? On the base of 73% enrollment in these communities. Even stronger for boys, 12 percentage points, somewhat smaller for girls, 5 percentage points, and not statistically distinguishable from zero. Okay, so then I want to walk you through quickly a number of robustness checks. So we play around with fixed effects. We can, instead of doing these comparisons, these differences comparisons within states, we can do them across the whole country. So then we would just have the quarter fixed effects, or the NOA round fixed effects without the state interactions, and we get very similar estimates. We also get very similar estimates if we interact the time dummies with municipality fixed effects, so that now we're only comparing more and less penetrated localities within the same municipality, and the same results obtained. And then we can go back to our original specification, which we're calling here SQ for state quarter. We can add in individual and household covariates. We can interact dummies for the percentile in the machination at both the municipality level and the locality level. Interact those dummies with the time dummies, basically to allow for differential trends between poorer places and less poor places. If anything, our estimates become stronger. We can interact the Prospera share with the linear time trend. And I didn't mention this before, it was on the previous slide, but we leave the biggest cities in Mexico out of this analysis because the program wasn't very present in the biggest cities. But if we add them back in, we get the same answers. Now, I should note, right, I said that these estimates are stable, right? They're especially stable for the 15 to 17-year-old age group, and especially for boys in the 15 to 17-year-old age group, right? So we noted that there were some effects for boys of secundaria age, but occasionally, some of the control variables, they don't erase the point estimates, but they bump them to make it look not statistically significant. So we're going to focus on this 15 to 17-year-old age group for the rest of the talk, both because we think the evidence is strongest for them, that there were these big effects on school enrollment, and also because we think that they're sort of the most interesting because they also have the highest rates of labor force participation. Okay, so there are a couple more robustness things I should check for you or show you. Sorry. One is to think about what exactly happened with becas Benito Juárez. Right? And so, there was this replacement program. For sure, there was a big disruption in 2019 when households suddenly stopped receiving their benefits, right? But then you can say, okay, but, by the end of the year, as much money had been distributed under becas Benito Juárez as was distributed under Prospera. At least that's what the official records say, okay? We don't know exactly when, the official records claim that benefits went out every 2 months over the year. We're not sure if that's actually true. We believe that by the end of the year that money went out, but we're not exactly sure if when it was recorded matches when the families actually received the money. But bottom line, there was this new program that in principle still incentivized high school students to go to school, right? And so that could lead you to say, well, maybe there's something going on here where other parts of the country benefited from becas Benito Juárez, even though the money was pulled out of the old Prospera communities. Or you could say maybe the effects are even the effect of fully removing Prospera would have been even bigger if this new program had existed. And so what we can do to think about this issue is to include a measure of how much the locality got from becas Benito Juárez over the course of the year. And it turns out that if anything, we don't think of this as really a well-identified estimate of the effect of becas Benito Juárez, but if anything, places that got more transfers from becas Benito Juárez saw declines in school enrollment from before 2019 to 2019. Right? So this estimate is negative. It's very small but negative, and it doesn't at all suggest that becas Benito Juárez boosted school enrollment in the parts of the country where it was. And the point estimate for Prospera doesn't change at all. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over those next two columns and move on to thinking about labor supply. So we're going to look at both boys and girls. We don't have high hopes that we're going to find effects for girls because they have lower labor force participation and they had weaker estimates for their schooling. But just for completeness, we're going to look at both sexes. You can see here from these event studies that there was this, these are noisy, but there is a bump up right around the time of fall 2019 when the dropout happens. There's a bump up in work, close to 10 percentage points. There's a bump up in weekly labor hours. Okay, this is unconditional weekly labor hours, so this includes the zeros. So this in large part reflects the same changes this employment dummy. And you see the level of monthly earnings, level of mean monthly earnings increasing as well. And these look, even these sort of disaggregated event study results look like they are sort of on the margin of statistical significance. When we run our regression, we indeed find a significant increase in employment, in the probability of work for boys of 8 percentage points, an increase in weekly hours of 5 hours, and an increase in income on average of about 450 pesos. Right? So that average increase is not large enough to make up for the loss in benefits from Prospera. But if you think about the fact that only that 450 only reflects an increase in employment of 8 percentage points, there were a large number of boys who did go to work and make up the difference that they lost from losing the benefit. Even actually, there were several who made back who made a lot more working than their families lost from losing this work. And so you can see a logic here of dropping out and starting to work because there was money on the table to take. Okay, so the last table I want to show you is just looking at the boys, because for girls we don't see any effects on labor market outcomes. Okay, but just looking at these boys, think about, instead of just having a dummy for whether they're working or not, let's think about what field they're working in. Okay, so these are going to be effects on the probability of working in particular sectors, in particular industries. Okay. And these are going to be unconditional on working. So basically, if you are working in construction, for the first column, you get 1. If you're not working construction, regardless of whether you're working in a different industry or you're not working at all, you get 0. Okay. So basically, all of these effects should add up to the total effect on labor force participation that we saw on the previous slide. And so the sort of interesting thing here, so the majority of boys who are working, or I guess at least the plurality of boys who are working in this age group, in these parts of Mexico, leaving out the big cities, are working in agriculture, are working on farms. Okay? But there is no change in labor supply in the agricultural sector. The modal dropout, the modal Prospera dropout, the modal rollback dropout is working in construction, right? So the largest increases in work are in construction. There are also increases in commerce and in services, but the biggest one is in construction, which is going to be very interesting when we think about what wages look like for young men working in construction with and without high school education. Okay, so that's what I'll look at on the next slide for you. So here, what we're doing, the notes here at the bottom are super important. Okay, so we basically want to think about like, what is the decision problem facing these boys whose families lose benefits, right? What are they thinking? What are their options? How much can they anticipate making in the near term, in the near future, and in the distant future when they drop out of school and start working? And so to do this, we're going to look at slightly older men from the NOA. We're going to look at basically to like remove selection, comparing people who are still in that age where they could be going to school. We're going to start looking at young men starting at age 20. And we're going to compare men who finished secundaria but didn't finish preparatoria with men who finished preparatoria and then stopped, right? So there are going to be these people who stopped after high school and these people who stopped after middle school, right? And so there are, this is subject to the usual concerns. There are various selection biases going on here. We don't claim that we're estimating the causal effect of finishing high school here, but it gives you a sense of what wages look like for these sorts of workers in these different sectors. And so we noted that the modal dropout, the modal Prospera rollback dropout, decided to work or got a job in construction, right? And here you can see that here are the wages right at the beginning of the career for 20 to 24-year-olds for people who didn't finish high school who are working in construction. They are higher than wages for any other school and industry combination, right? So you can do as well working in construction without high school, without finishing high school, as you can in any other sector with or without high school, right? And so that means, right, that like for these boys, if they're in households that have liquidity constraints, that can't finance education, you know, that could really use the cash right now, there are big benefits to leaving school and getting a job in construction. It's going to take until you reach, you know, your 30s when these gaps emerge, when there are big benefits from having stayed in school. But right at the start, like in the teens, probably in the teens, we don't see it here, but definitely in the 20s, right, it looks like you can do as well in construction without a high school degree as you can anywhere else in the economy. And so we think that this is sort of like consistent with like basic models and with basic motivations for conditional cash transfer programs. And we also think that they probably imply that right now, you know, in the few years after the rollback, probably this didn't have a big negative effect on these boys' lives, but in 10 or 20 years, these boys will probably be worse off than they would have been if the program had continued. Okay, I'm probably out of time, so let me just conclude by saying that, you know, these are really large effects of rolling back this large social program. You know, boys became 12 percentage points less likely to be enrolled in school, and we think that these effects are especially remarkable because the money didn't go back to wealthy taxpayers. The money went into another program that was supposed to be promoting education, and yet still we find these big effects. And then, finally, I showed you those sector-specific results. We think that it looks like the effects are going to turn out to be negative over these boys' lives as they get older. That they will lose on significant lifetime earnings as a result of having dropped out. And we think this is sort of a classic case for government intervention. If you have liquidity-constrained families that are cash-constrained and can't finance education, this is exactly what you would expect to happen if you pull back on this benefit. Okay, thanks very much. I'm happy to speak.
Muchas gracias, Tom, por la presentación. Pasamos a la ronda de preguntas y respuestas. ¿Preguntas? Gerardo y luego Alex.
Bueno, una parte de tu investigación concuerda mucho con otras investigaciones que ya se han hecho con relación a la distribución de las transferencias por deciles y concuerdan en que la buena parte, digamos, de esas transferencias se concentran en los sectores medios y no tanto en los bajos, ¿no? En los sectores bajos de población. Entonces, bueno, eso por un lado, ¿no? Por otro lado, en el caso de las becas educativas, yo creo que hay que distinguir, lo haces por ahí, mencionas los diferentes tipos de becas que hay, pero sí cambia, son muy diferentes, ¿no? Las becas, por ejemplo, las que son de primaria, ¿no? O las becas de Benito Juárez para la educación básica, que esas son básicamente una beca por familia, y las becas que son para la educación media, esas son por persona, ¿no? Entonces, ahí hay una diferencia, y luego vienen las becas para la educación superior, ¿no? Que son las que más dinero se llevan en realidad, y también la cobertura que hay de cada uno de esos programas también es diferente. O sea, las becas Benito Juárez para la educación básica ronda como por el 30%, y luego cuando ya te vas a las que en teoría son universales, la cobertura baja, ¿no? Al 20%, en fin. Hay ahí unos niveles, y luego la otra, y luego ya viendo ya al final tus resultados, ¿no? ¿Qué tanto tuvo que ver también este asunto de la deserción escolar con la pandemia? O sea, ya también se han hecho estudios que con la pandemia hubo una deserción muy grande, sobre todo en educación media superior, sí, y que no se ha logrado recuperar. en años posteriores, ¿no? Se han hecho con otras fuentes, digamos, con otras fuentes de información que sí te permiten hacer análisis de más tiempo, ¿no?
Sí, muchas gracias. Estoy de acuerdo de que el programa de becas Pito Juárez es muy diferente que el programa anterior y básicamente nosotros pensamos o creemos que para las familias que recibieron Frontera es como si no hay programa después de la terminación de postura. O sea que sí, hay jóvenes en ciudades grandes que son de familias de clase media que reciben transferencias hoy día, pero para estas familias en áreas rurales muy pobres no reciben tanto. Por el tema de COVID, no sé tanto, porque para nosotros estudiando o investigando el efecto de la terminación de postura, no sabemos, bueno, no tenemos datos después de COVID. Bueno, ya en 2022, 23 sí tenemos datos, pero no tenemos cogidos de localidades en ¿se dice
No,
sí.
Justo lo dices invertido.
Así que no tengo mucho que decir sobre eso, pero es muy importante, definitivamente. Gracias.
Sí, Alex, adelante.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
Good afternoon, my dear colleagues and economists. I would like to congratulate first Professor Tom Bogle for his presentation here at Colef Department of Economics. Thank you for coming. I'm Professor Alejandro Bautista, Professor of Economics for 25 years here at Colef. Ex-alumni of UCSD, one of my alma maters. I was there as an undergrad, also as a visiting professor, and 2 times fellow at UCSD. So it's great having you here. Here are some comments and suggestions for the paper rolling back pobreza. And first of all, Mexico has implemented several anti-poverty programs over the years, and the most notable are the conditional cash transfer initiatives, the Pobreza, Oportunidades, Prospera, launched in '97 as Pobreza. And this program was aimed to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty. By focusing on education, health, and nutrition, it was later renamed Oportunidades. And at last, Pobreza. And the key features were that families received the cash transfers conditional on children attending school and having their health checkups and participating in nutrition workshops. And the payments were often directed to women as primary beneficiaries. The impact of the program, as it was measured in other studies, is the increased school enrollment, the improved health outcomes, and the reduced poverty in rural areas. It has become a model worldwide for this type of programs. But we need to compare it with those becas, Benito Juárez, that you mentioned under the administration of President Obrador, because Frontera was replaced by the programs of Benito Juárez, which provides scholarships for students in public education. But unlike its predecessor, this program eliminated many conditionalities, and it focused on providing financial support the students without requiring the proof of poverty. We had also other initiatives, programs targeting specific groups such as unemployed mothers or rural communities, and they were implemented in last administration. And these initiatives often aim to empower women and improve access to education and health care. These programs have varying degrees of success, with some challenges in ensuring sustainability and addressing systemic issues like corruption and economic stagnation in Mexico, which have to be addressed. I would like to mention the clarity of the findings in your paper. The paper effectively highlights the immediate impact of programs rolled back on school enrollment and youth labor, with the distinction between the effects of rollout and rollback is insightful, especially the shift in age groups affected. This adds up to the understanding of Pobreza's long-term adaptation to educational needs. The findings underscore the vulnerability of marginalized populations to sudden policy changes. This could be further emphasized to advocate for mechanisms that ensure continuity of transitions in social programs. The gender dynamics are good. The paper notes the pronounced effects on boys as high school age. It might be valuable to explore why these effects are more significant for boys and whether similar patterns were observed for girls in other contexts and other studies. The long-term impacts. We should consider discussing the potential long-term consequences of the roadmap on affected youth, such as future earning potential and societal contributions. And the broader context, situating pobreza within the global landscape, as conditional cash transfer programs and that can provide a comparative perspective and highlight its unique features. And my question would be, how would you compare this program with other programs around the world? I know you have make studies in the African context, and how successful are those anti-poverty programs around the world? Finally, thank you for coming to Colef and giving us an excellent presentation, Professor Bogle. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon and enjoy Baja and a great return to the U.S., to UCSD. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad somebody turned up the volume because I was struggling to hear you for the beginning, but I heard the second half very, very well. I guess I would. Well, you finished by asking for comparison between this program and others around the world. There are many studies now of conditional cash transfer programs, and most of them find increases in education. I mean, there's a big debate about whether benefits should be conditional or not, and there are some interesting nuanced results of comparing conditional transfers with unconditional transfers. And I don't think studies like this one, or studies, most studies actually on pobreza itself, can really speak to the benefits of conditionality versus not having conditionality. It's clear that that this program, which included conditionality but also included a lot of cash, right, to families, helped raise education. There is some, so I don't know if you've ever seen Esther Duflo, who is an esteemed Nobel laureate. She, for not this decade, but the last decade, in the 2010s, she was going around comparing the cost effectiveness of pobreza with, deworming pills in Kenya and a few other interventions, filming teachers in classrooms and so on. And the sheer amount of money that's spent on pobreza made it seem like it was not very cost effective. Yes, it boosted schooling, but it cost a lot of money. Susan has taught me that that's not really a fair comparison, because the money itself is useful to families. It's an anti-poverty program, right? And we shouldn't just look for effects on schooling. I mean, the transfer of money is also useful to the families. So there are a lot of interesting questions, both comparing programs across countries, comparing program details, thinking about whether the conditionality on schooling is important or not, or what consequences it has. And then finally thinking about comparisons of this program with other, school promotion programs. So that's not a very concrete answer, but I think you're right. There are a lot of very interesting issues to think about there, and also interesting issues to think about, like what will happen if other big programs like this come crashing down for political reasons. But you also asked a question that I think is very interesting. What's going on here? Why is it just the boys who really show up in these results? And that's especially interesting, because it seemed like at rollout in the initial randomized trial, for example, girls benefited a lot from the program. And indeed, in the long-run follow-up, so Susan and I have a paper using quasi-experimental variation, looking at long-run follow-up of the original cohorts. And Caridad Araujo and Karen McCoors have a long-run follow-up of the RCT, and both of those find bigger effects on women than on men, right? On their education, also on their other outcomes in adulthood, perhaps because the main mechanism is through education. And so it's very interesting, right, that the main affected group 20 years later, when the program was ended, is boys, right? And so we have some thoughts on that, right? Maybe norms about girls' education changed. Maybe as a result, norms about girls' education do seem to have changed. Maybe that's in part due to the program. We're not sure about that. Now it really seems like the work-school trade-off matters a lot, right? And boys it looks like boys have a much greater tendency to be working in general, regardless of the program. And maybe face greater incentive to leave school and start work as teenagers. Right? There aren't too many, construction jobs for teenage girls, but there are a lot for teenage boys, I guess. But that's conjecture. We don't have any strong evidence in favor of particular reasons for the gender differences.
Sí. Omar.
Bueno, muy bien. Tom, muy interesante la verdad el artículo. Yo quería comentarte, igual algunas cosas y unas más en carácter de algunas cuestiones que pueden derivar de reflexiones sobre el paper y otras de carácter técnico. Bueno, una de las cosas sobre justo lo que estás señalando, este cambio, ¿no? De un programa focalizado a un programa que es que tiene una característica más masiva. No se puede decir universalización, pero bueno, la manera en cómo hizo como muy plano, ¿no? La manera en cómo atendió el asunto de ya no atender el número de hijos ni la diferencia por niño o niña, ¿no? Que traía un poco esto de lo que había hecho Jerry Berman en Filipinas, ¿no? En los 80s, ¿no? Esta base de por qué dar una beca más alta a las niñas que a los niños, ¿no? Entonces no sé si aquí, por ejemplo, pensando, sí, esa es una primera pregunta, ahorita voy con varias, pero justamente si esta cuestión podría haber hecho en que si iban a hacer eso, se tendrían que haber como no focalizado, sino más bien haber incidido más en las localidades más pobres para no dejar sin cobertura a estas familias que dices, ¿no? Justamente las familias que perdieron el acceso entre que se acabó Prospera y empezó las becas Benito Juárez, hubo un periodo, ¿no? Como de algunos meses donde quedaron en la indefensión, ¿no? Las personas, ¿no? Entonces ahí hay un problema sobre todo en las localidades más pequeñas, ¿no? También eso en varios de los programas que se han aplicado, como que se han aplicado más o se han comenzado a operar más en las localidades más grandes, incluso tanto en el gobierno de AMLO como en el de Peña Nieto, con esta cuestión de la estrategia sin hambre. También los comedores empezaron más en las localidades como municipios del Estado de México que son con alta población, como Ecatepec, Nesa, ¿no? Entonces ahí no sé si debieron como primero empezar en las localidades más pequeñas para justamente no tener tantos, donde podría ser más sensible, mayor el efecto del abandono escolar o de la entrada al mercado laboral a edades tempranas en empleos precarios, ¿no? Esa es una primera cuestión. Estos efectos que se han venido desde la primera evaluación de IFPRI que hizo justamente Susan, estuvo con Jerry Berman, ¿no? En estos efectos era una medición más de efectos intermedios, ¿no? Pero muchos de estos efectos también, como la reducción, el aumento en la asistencia a las escuelas, las charlas para la parte médica, todas estas cuestiones eran parte de las corresponsabilidades que tenían que tener las personas para poder gozar del programa, ¿no? Y esta cuestión del manejo del padrón, digo, en 20 años tuvo muchas dificultades, porque creo que Matías Cataneo quería hacer una medición, ¿no? Con regresiones discontinuas de toda esta parte, y no pudo, porque no se podía dar un seguimiento pleno a este padrón de las enceles. Digo, están bien, pero cuando quieres juntarlas como que hay mucha dificultad, ¿no? Entonces ahí finalmente se tuvo que aplicar un poco lo que han hecho ustedes, ¿no? Y muchos de utilizar datos secundarios, ¿no? Para poder hacer la medición, ¿no? Entonces, porque esta cuestión de la medición de romper el círculo intergeneracional de la pobreza, que era el objetivo principal del programa, bueno, al menos en las matrices de marco lógico de los años 2015 hacia adelante, ¿no? Entonces ahí no sé, digo, pensar si este efecto se podría medir de alguna manera. Hubo un intento, creo que viene de Chile, ¿no? La que hizo un trabajo sobre movilidad ocupacional y no encontró como resultados donde se hubiera podido ver si hubo un efecto real de cambio, ¿no? Una movilidad ocupacional intergeneracional entre padres e hijos, para si estabas en un empleo como jornalero agrícola, a un aumento en un empleo como de mayor calidad, ¿no? ¿Sí? Y bueno, en la otra cuestión, lo que quería preguntarte, digo, lo del Event Studies con corte transversal, justo es todo un problema. Yo estaba, digo, lo vi que lo pudiste hacer. En el artículo no lo vi tanto, ahorita lo vi mucho más claro, pero digo, esta cuestión es cómo, digo, un poquito qué retos te enfrentas cuando tienes datos como las ENOE, o por ejemplo, si utilizas cortes transversales repetidos como la ENIG o algunas otras encuestas, cómo ir resolviendo estas cuestiones de por ejemplo, lo que te dicen, ¿no? Los modelos que luego utilizan doble robustez, que bueno, necesitas un panel, si no tienes un panel y solo tienes cortes transversales es difícil hacerlo, cómo manejar la cuestión de los errores a nivel de clúster. Eso sería básicamente. Perdón, es mucho, pero...
Uno de esos temas son difíciles para mí explicar en español, así que voy a hablar en inglés. Quiero practicar mi español, pero
Está bien, no, adelante.
no puedo hablar de event studies en español. So let me start with the event studies. The main disadvantage for a locality level difference or a geography based difference in difference in a survey like this is actually, especially small geography like a locality, is that the same localities don't appear in the survey for more than the big Mexico City appears every quarter, but the tiny localities they come in for 5 quarters for the panel, for the small panel, and then they drop out and you never see them again. And so then we have to rely on this continuous representation of the cross-sectional heterogeneity, which is, I think, okay, but is a limitation. Other than that, I don't think there are any really big issues with using the repeated cross-sectional data instead of actual panel data. The challenge here that I didn't include because I know I only had 45-50 minutes. The challenge here, which is a new challenge that we won't the challenge has existed forever, but we never knew it before, is that it's not really that clear under weak assumptions what we learn from interacting a share household receiving benefit with the post rollback dummy. It's not like we applied economists thought, okay, you can do this thing if you have a treated, like a dummy for treated and untreated before and after, and then you run that regression exactly what we did here, but you have dummy variables instead of a continuous variable, then the interaction term gives you the average treatment effect. That can be proven. But when you have a continuous variable of exposure, it's actually kind of hard to interpret that interaction term. We've been doing it for 20 years. But there's a new paper that, I don't know if it's forthcoming or if it's still R&R at the American Economic Review, that says, hey everybody, this isn't telling us what we think it's telling us. And interpreting that continuous interaction term is a lot harder. This applies to both the point estimate difference, but also the event study, right? It applies to both the event study and to the shorter regression. And so there's going to be some reckoning with that paper, just the same way that in 2004, Duflo and co-authors wrote that paper on clustering standard errors, and suddenly everybody started clustering their standard errors. Now everybody's suddenly going to start saying, actually, it's not clear how we should interpret exactly the estimate that I showed you. So what we can do like a binary difference in difference between places where everybody was getting Prospera before and places where nobody was getting Prospera before. And actually, when we do that, the effects are a little bigger than we'll report here. So that's in the appendix. So we'll spend some time thinking about that, but that's one, like a technical challenge. On the intergenerational question, I don't think, I don't know if we'll ever be able to study the intergenerational consequences of this episode because COVID happened right after it, and COVID was enormous and affected everybody. All these young people were stuck at home and not going to school, and it's going to be really hard to interpret what happened to these cohorts without thinking first about COVID. But the paper that I mentioned, the quasi-experimental paper I mentioned that Susan and I wrote a few years ago, and this more recent paper by Araujo and McCours, where they studied, where they went and found the original kids from the RCT. They went to all parts of Mexico. They tried to find them in the U.S. if they migrate to the U.S. And they find, the long-term effects are nuanced. It's not like there was a complete transformation in the lives of these kids, but you do find them working more and making somewhat more money, right? It's sort of, it's not a world of poverty traps where you unleash people from a poverty trap by getting them to stay in school for a few more years, but there are measurable benefits in the long term when these kids are adults.
¿Alguien más tiene alguna pregunta? Bueno, aprovechando, yo tengo varias. Entonces, muchas gracias por la presentación. Me llamó la atención, primero dices que hacen el estudio a nivel localidad, o los datos individuales, pero yo me acuerdo que la ENOE tenía información de localidad y luego la quitaron.
Sí.
Y luego la volvieron a poner, ¿o cómo la consiguieron?
Bueno, la quitaron en 2022 y 2023. Bueno, después de COVID no hay localidades. No hay.
Sí.
No sé si en el 24.
Ah, sí.
No sé.
Sí, es que yo me acuerdo más o menos ahí como por 2012, 2013, cuando bajaba mucho estas bases, estaban y luego la quitaron.
Ah, ok.
Pero por esa época.
Nosotros lo tenemos hasta 2020.
Ok.
Sí.
Va.
Están ahora.
Ok, aprovecharlas. Y luego, por ejemplo...
Es increíble, para mí me parece increíble, porque en los Estados Unidos nunca van a poner los códigos de la localidad.
Sí.
Es importante.
Seguridad, muy específico. Y luego, por ejemplo, me llama la atención que dicen que se enfocan en localidades de menos de 100,000 habitantes. Entonces, como mencionaste, aquí es localidades donde el Prospera Oportunidades tenía una participación muy grande y las Benito Juárez probablemente tienen poca participación. Entonces, ¿no será como que si hubieran hecho el análisis en localidades mayores, como que hubieran encontrado más los efectos positivos de la Benito Juárez, como que también están captando como diferencias geográficas en los impactos, de que, por ejemplo, en estas se ve de que quitaron el Prospera, pero el Benito Juárez no entró tanto, pero a lo mejor en localidades más grandes, el Prospera casi, como no había muchos, no hubo tanto, pero hubo el efecto positivo de que entraron muchas Benito Juárez. No sé si ahí como podría haber efectos geográficos espaciales diferenciados y que nomás están captando una parte, ¿sí? Y luego también un poco el factor tiempo, de que a lo mejor, o sea, sí se quitó el Prospera, pero las Benito Juárez apenas estaban arrancando, entonces están como subestimando, porque como que el programa apenas estaba empezando y que probablemente se hubieran visto 2 años después, si hubiera habido cierto efecto que hubiera contrarrestado, efecto positivo que hubiera contrarrestado. Eso es otra. Y luego también no sé si como que ha cambiado un poco el mercado de trabajo en México, ¿no? O sea, por ejemplo, en los primeros años de AMLO, con estos incrementos del salario mínimo, como que aumentaron los salarios de los jóvenes, de las mujeres, ¿no? De personas no calificadas, y también han estado disminuyendo los retornos a la educación en México. Entonces, como que ahora es más atractivo tal vez trabajar y menos atractivo estudiar que hace unos años, y a lo mejor también está captando algo de eso, no sé. Gracias.
Okay, I'm going to switch to English again because the more detailed the questions, the harder it is for me to keep track of everything in Spanish. Okay, so on the small versus big communities, this was something I didn't like it. I don't like sample restrictions. I told Susan and Fernanda we should just include every city, and they said, but Tom, it's ridiculous. I mean, in the big cities, like a very small share of houses are getting it, and it's going to be like most of our sample lives in big cities, and so we're going to end up comparing, small places where a lot of people are getting Prospero with these big cities, and there's no reason why we should expect the parallel trends assumption to hold. And so we had that debate, and they won because they know more than I do. In the end, it doesn't really matter very much what we do with big cities versus small, and it's sort of an interesting thing. So I didn't show you our results on heterogeneity in the effects. So if we look to see which sorts of households, which sorts of localities have larger effects, the sample based on, say, the education of the household head, or based on the size of the community, or the marginación category of the locality, right? We do see that the effects are bigger in less educated households. So in households where the household head didn't go beyond primaria, then you find much bigger effects in those households than the better off households, which makes sense, right? Because this program was benefiting poor households, and that's what you should expect to see. But if you look across different categories of locality size, or locality population, or if you look across even different categories of the marginación, of the nivel de marginación. Yeah, but the 5-1, not the nivel. Yeah. You actually see similar effects estimated within each of those categories, and that was surprising to me at first. But then I understood that actually you're building in a lot of the heterogeneity in with the measure of the Prospero penetration, right? So when you're comparing, places that are fully penetrated, that have 100% of households receiving Prospero, with places that have 50% of households, that is already building in a comparison of like the bigger places with the smaller places. And so a lot of the geography heterogeneity that we might have expected to see doesn't show up in the results when we use this geography-based measure of penetration. I suspect that if we had household level variation in whether the household was receiving Prospero or not, we might see bigger differences across space than in this at a few moments we thought like maybe we should look just at the big cities and ask whether becas mitopars benefited big cities, right? We don't find any evidence, and we don't find any evidence of benefits of mitopars in general. And that's consistent, by the way, with CONAPO had a study that they presented a couple of years ago that was largely consistent with our results. It's an interesting question to ask, but it's hard to do because there are a lot of people living in big cities, but there aren't that many big cities to have a very rich differences design. We have just a few units changing with slightly different prevalence of becas mitopars benefits, and so there's a limit to how much we can say about it. There's also a limit to what we can say. You're absolutely right. Maybe becas mitopars just took some time to start working. Given the constraints of the data we face, we can't say anything about that at this paper. Right? We basically get a snapshot of what happened exactly when this big policy change happened. It looks like the rollout of becas mitopars was a bit of a mess, right? So the money got out by the end of the year, but it was haphazard, and there was a lot happening by word of mouth. There weren't a lot of big announcements inviting people to sign up. And so, at least not nationally, and so it's entirely possible that things got better over time.
¿Alguien más? ¿Una pregunta? Sí, Cristian.
Ya comentamos algo, pero ¿cuáles serían los
Sí.
Les decía que ya habían comentado algo, pero ¿cuáles serían los principales efectos en términos de reducción de la pobreza por el cambio de enfoque de las condicionalidades a un enfoque más universalista? ¿Cuáles serían o cuáles podrían ser?
Bueno, es una pregunta muy difícil. ¿Qué puedo decir? This was a policy change that held the amount of money fixed and redistributed away from the poor, which seems to have been very bad for the poor. Right? It also seems to have been very politically popular because, AMLO's political party has continued to do very well. Right? So I think there's the question of whether benefits should be universal is an interesting one because it can sustain public support for programs that otherwise, people further up in the income distribution may not support in the long term. But certainly, if the total amount of money in the program stays constant and becomes less targeted toward the poor suffer as a. I think the results are consistent with my results are consistent with the idea that the poor suffer as a result of such a change.
Gracias. ¿Alguien más? Listo. Bueno, muy bien, pues muchas gracias, Tom, por la conferencia muy interesante. Voy a hacer lectura de la constancia. Dice, el Colegio de la Frontera Norte, a través del Departamento de Estudios Económicos, otorga la presente constancia al Dr. Tom Vogel por impartir la conferencia Escuela y trabajo tras el fin de un programa de lucha contra la pobreza, día 11 de abril de 2025, en las instalaciones del Colef, en Tijuana, Baja California. Firma un servidor, Pedro Raca.
Gracias. Y lo siento que mi español no es tan bien que puedo hablar en español por todo el tiempo, pero en el futuro debo regresar aquí y practicar mucho y entonces la siguiente vez voy a hablar en español.
Perfecto. Gracias a todos, buenas tardes. Gracias, Alex.